Welcome to the Real Life Buyer podcast. In this podcast, you will hear interviews with business owners, entrepreneurs, thought leaders, authors, and technical specialists in their field. These professionals will hasten your development, accelerate your career, and broaden your business know-how. Now, introducing your host, Dave Barr, interviewing with a purchasing twist.
Hello, and welcome to the Real Life Buyer. When purchasing products and services from abroad, do you feel confident that you understand the supplier's culture sufficiently to build a successful relationship? When selling into international markets, how do you know the right approach if you do not understand the culture of the client? And when climbing the corporate ladder in an international business, how do you ensure your style and behaviors fit with your new colleagues? My guest today is Christian Hoeferle, also known as the Culture Guy. Christian has been the president and CEO of the Culture Mastery for over 8 years. He is the co-owner of the Center of NLP based in Atlanta and is the creator and host of the Culture Guy podcast. Today, I wish to learn how knowledge of cultural differences may be learned and applied in business to increase the chances of success in commercial relationships. So, without further ado, I welcome Christian onto the podcast. Hi, Christian.
Hey, Dave. Thanks for having me.
Absolute pleasure. Great to have you on the show. Obviously, an area I'm particularly interested in because I deal with lots of cultures in my day-to-day role. But what inspired you to pursue a career in cultural training, and what do you find most fulfilling about the work you do?
Well, that's an interesting question because it probably does not deliver the clean-cut answer that some of you might expect. Nothing prompted me to pursue a career in this field because I didn't know this field existed. I didn't go to school for this. I did not study this. I stumbled into this, one might say. So I grew up in southeastern Germany and had lots of exposure to the English-speaking world throughout my teenage years as a foreign exchange student to the United States, and never thought that this experience on a personal level would lead me into a professional application. So my first career, if you will, my first professional endeavors were in the field of media and journalism. And I worked for a trade publishing company. I worked for a magazine in the music industry, similar to what the Billboard magazine in the United States is, or Music Week in England. We had a similar trade magazine, or there still exists that trade magazine in Germany. And my colleagues always put me on the assignment that dealt with English-speaking people. I said, well, let Christian handle this. He gets them. And this phrase, he gets them, I made that mean, well, my English is probably better than any of yours. So sure, yeah, let me handle this. Now in hindsight, I understand it was more than simply the linguistic part of it. I understood the Anglo mindset due to my early exposure to it. And still, the dots didn't connect. Only after my wife and I had moved to the United States and into an area of the United States that at that point was rather monocultural, very, I wouldn't say isolated, but it was not New York, it was not San Francisco, it was the Tennessee Valley with its quite monocultural population. And all of a sudden, a global player landed there and decided to build a manufacturing plant, which put me in a privileged position because I was the only or one of the few Germans on the ground who could help Americans deal with a German manufacturing company. And I realized, wait a minute, my personal and professional background may actually be a monetizable asset. That may actually be something that I could cast into an offering, a service portfolio that will help others. And even as I began doing that, I wasn't quite sure what I was doing. This was a learning as I went along with it. So now, 15, 16 years later, I formalized it now. I know what I'm doing, I think. And most people in the industry would probably say, yeah, I've heard of that guy. I think we know what he's doing. So, but that was nothing that I had planned or nothing that was on my career goals as a teenager or a young adult.
Sure. So a little bit of fate intervened perhaps throughout your journey.
Yeah.
Could be. So obviously now you're well into, the experiences, shall we say, that you've developed over the many years. How do you now define and perhaps approach cross-cultural communication in business? And what would you say are the common challenges that companies and individuals face in this area?
Well, it often depends on which cultures are represented in that business, right? Initially, as I began my work, the constellation was typically between the German-speaking world of Europe and the English-speaking world of North America. That was the field that I was placed into, or that I allowed myself to dabble in. And between German speakers and English speakers, the recurring cross-cultural communication challenge is that of directness or lack thereof. German speakers tend to be brutally direct to a fault in a rather aggressive, almost abrasive manner to non-German speakers. I think the only cultures that would play along with that Germanness are the Dutchies, as well as Russians and Israelis tend to be, and the Danes to a certain degree as well, can be quite direct. That doesn't work well in an English-speaking environment. It doesn't matter if it's the US or Canada. It doesn't matter if it's Great Britain or even Australia, New Zealand, other English-speaking cultures, Anglo cultures, that I call them, that don't deal well with that level of bluntness and directness. So that is something that we often see. Now, I just got off a call with a client in southern India where that challenge would be even more pronounced if it were between Germany and India. Now, this is an Indian couple who are about to relocate to the southern United States for a work assignment, where the indirectness or directness of speech may not be the dominant challenge, right? There, the challenges might more be on how do we interact with each other based on our role in society? Do we have a position in a real or in a perceived hierarchy? And if so, how do I recognize it? And once I recognize it, how do I allow that to inform and reflect how I communicate with you? So it really depends on the context and the constellation of cultures that come together to say, well, this is how we approach it, right? There's no uniform approach.
Yeah. Okay. So you've got to be very adaptable, I guess, very conscious of the people that are coming to you, your clients, and who they're interacting with, and say, okay, what is the recipe today, I guess.
Right. Exactly.
Okay. So that leads me on nicely to thinking about training. Now, you have now trained, I guess, many, many people. So obviously we've talked about the recipe, but there must be some kind of training strategy that you build for sort of cultural competence and awareness. I'm thinking particularly of procurement people. Obviously, we're meeting lots of different people from all around the world regularly, and we're regularly interacting with them on a global platform and through multiple media forms. So when you're dealing in that context, how do you develop a training strategy to deal with that and obviously help them in their journey?
Well, I would say at least a two-prong approach. One, there is a standard template that, just saying that phrase hurts my brain, a standard template. There's nothing like this in my field, but there is somewhat of a consistent pattern that we use, or that I use in our company with our trainers, which goes from culture general to culture specific. Now, that is a very loose definition, but based on that, we will then customize to a client specific requirement. So what do I mean by culture general to culture specific? If a client approaches the topic of cross-cultural communication for the first time, we need to lay a little bit of a foundation. We need to define what we're talking about, because most people who come to us for the first time or engage with people like us for the first time, they only have a very limited idea of what our work will look like and feel like. So we explain the concept of culture and how it affects our behavior at home and abroad, and how our value system and our culture are indicative of how we express our thoughts, feelings, opinions, and how we negotiate or how we inquire about services and maybe a vendor's possibility to supply what we need. So we go from the culture general down into the specifics then. So if you are a company dealing with let's say, 3 specific regions of the world, then yes, then we will look at the culture specifics of, let's say, India, Japan, and Brazil, just to give you an example, right? And that while that would be a very broad and overly generic template, and there it is again, that word that I loathe, we will use that as the foundation to then prop on top what serves that client in their specific situations. So as an example, right when the pandemic began, and it sounds like it's a million years ago, but it's not that long ago. When the pandemic began, we worked with a medical device manufacturer in the Silicon Valley, highly specific intellectual property, very specific needs in terms of talent internally, but also needs in terms of supply chain, what they need to build their machines. For instance, they need tungsten as a metal to build their gamma ray guns to kill cancer cells. And they were insourcing, not outsourcing, they were insourcing a customer service IT support team in India. And this is a company with a presence around the world. Hospitals around the world use their equipment. So we really had to listen to that client-specific situation. I couldn't just pull out an India training for them, say, oh, this is how you work with Indians. Yeah, sure. But how have you worked with India before? What, if so, had been your biggest challenges? What is it you're trying to accomplish? And based on all this, we then define who trains that group. Where do we do that training? Is that in person? Is that virtual? Is it a hybrid of both? Do we need somebody who is a native speaker of the target language? Or do we, there's so many factors that play into this, that, and this is something that we pride ourselves in our company, is that we really customize our training or coaching approach to what the company or the client wants, not what I think might be good for them. It starts with the listening and then with the serving.
It's quite interesting. I was thinking about whether there be like a project matrix framework that you could build for each, let's say, each culture, each country, and how do those fit and overlay across each other. I was interested to see how you kind of work with that kind of principle in some way.
Of course we do. And don't get me wrong, there are these principles, right? And we make use of them. We call them cultural comparison frameworks. We work with them extensively. They're one tool in the toolbox. They're not the only approach we take. And these cross-cultural comparison frameworks are fantastic as a tool. They also have their limitations. They're born out of a more European Western perspective. Dare I say, from a early post-colonial perspective, we, the Europeans, have understood the world because nothing in this world exists until we, the Europeans, discovered it and maybe put our flag into it. So, I mean, I, as a German, we have that history in our culture. You, as a Brit, you have that history in your culture as well. And I live outside my culture. I live in North America, a country that was formed by first colonialism and then violent land grab and a revolutionary approach to self-governance, which is still an ongoing experiment. And yet these cross-cultural comparison frameworks originated from a Western research approach, right? So it's Europeans looking at the world. And very often Europeans look at the world through the lens of nation states, which is maybe relevant within Europe, where most European countries somehow came into existence through a common cultural language history. Look at Great Britain, look at the Nordic countries, look at most of the European countries who have at their foundation a shared culture, history, language. Now, if you look around the world where national borders were often drawn arbitrarily based on our European colonization, that's difficult to define a culture by the flag by the colors of a flag or the name on the passport. So if you look at India, for example, a country that emerged from colonialism in the middle of the 20th century, a country with, depending on whom you ask, 22 to 26 official languages, multiple cultures, religions, you can't just say Indians are like this, because it really depends on where in India you look. You can't say China is like that. Even of Great Britain, you can't say the British are like this. There is no such thing as the Brit. They're Welsh, they're English, they're Northern English, they're the Scottish, they're the Northern Irish. And even within England, it depends on which part of England you're from. If you're a city person or if you're country, I don't have to tell you, you know better than me as a Brit. So these cross-cultural comparison frameworks often work along comparing nations with one another. And while that helps as a starting point for a conversation, we would do ourselves a disservice if we limit ourselves to the perspective of nationality equals culture. It's not as easy as that. So we need to drill a little deeper than that.
Yeah, totally understand where you're coming from. England's relatively small. Certainly when you compare it to the US, we're not much more than a state in some respects. As you say, the distance of 100 miles can be a huge difference in culture and how people behave, the things they like, et cetera, et cetera. So I really do understand. And what we're saying here, though, is don't look at Britain as a standard entity. You have to drill down to the location that perhaps you're going to do business with and see what specifics there are about that area that are different to perhaps you would see as a general, inverted commas, Brit, basically.
Right.
Yeah. Now, I guess therefore, these we're teasing out are some of the common misconceptions about cultural training. And this is how you go about addressing them, I guess, in your work. Is there like a formula, or is there something that you can help to share to say what are those misconceptions and how to avoid them?
Well, one misconception is when clients say, well, we need you to tell our team about the do's and don'ts of doing business with country XYZ, right? The do's and don'ts are fine and dandy. You probably don't need me to tell you about the do's and don'ts. I'm sure there's an app for that, or if you prefer a book or a website. I often use an image in our training in the culture general part where you'll see an alligator floating in water with the nostrils and the eyeballs and a little bit of its tail peeking out of the water and the rest of the body submerged under the water surface. And the parts that are noticeable to our mind that are peeking out of the water surface, those are the do's and don'ts, right? This is what our five senses are computing. We can see, we can hear, we can taste, touch, smell. So when we approach a new culture, these are the first impressions we have. We see the architecture. We see how people are dressed. We see how they act in space with one another. Do they shake hands? Do they elbow check? Do they fist bump now? Do they bow? What do they do, right? These are the do's or the don'ts. I can taste their food. I could smell the air. I could listen to the music. I can see the architecture. There's what our senses are picking up is the information that I gather in that place, and my brain gives that meaning. Now I can see, okay, they do it this way, so I better do it that way too. They don't do that, which I would prefer. They don't seem to do that. Okay, well, then let me not do that also in order to connect. However, that doesn't explain the why, the underlying reasons of these do's and don'ts. So that's that alligator floating under the water surface. The big belly of the beast is the whys that have the buoyancy to float the do's and don'ts above the water surface, right? And understanding the whys, our five senses don't really help much because I can't see what people believe and I cannot hear which philosophical principles they follow. I cannot touch and grab the value systems in which people operate, right? So that takes a little longer to decipher and to unpack. And this is what I tell our clients when they come to us with that misconception of, yeah, we need to learn about the do's and don'ts. Sure you do. Now, how would you feel about if I explain to you, or one of our trainers really explains to you what creates these do's and don'ts and how they make sense in that culture? They might not make sense to you, but simply memorizing them isn't going to make you much more successful. If you understand the underlying reasons why people behave a certain way or don't behave that way, then it might be easier for you to accept these behaviors that are maybe a little bit unusual or uncommon to you, right? So that's one of the biggest misconceptions we'd like to get out of the way in the beginning.
Yeah, I love that analogy. That crocodile analogy, I think, is fantastic. It really helps to bring it out. And basically, you can't, in this case, read a book by its cover. You've got to get into the belly of the beast, as you say, to find out more. And this is really, again, helps me now in respect that not only societies, but individual businesses have cultures. And even though you're training people about, let's say, the societal things that you can, because you're going into, let's say, a region and the principles of that region, when it comes to an individual business that potentially has been owned perhaps by a solopreneur for many years, the cultures, I guess, in that business are going to be very specific to the owner or the owners of that business. And these businesses can also have, I guess, deeply rooted religious and gender biases potentially as well.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah. So when you look at the cultural training, how do you go about going beyond some of the things we discussed and consider the matter of, for example, inclusion and diversity when faced with that difficulty?
Well, first of all, I, as a facilitator in a room like this, have to be aware that I have my own biases, right? None of us are free of those. And while common corporate culture in the West may have stigmatized biases as something we should all get rid of, I disagree. This is what keeps our brains sane. A bias is something that our human mind has developed over the course of evolution to allow us to quickly discern between that which we want to engage with and that which we want to run away from because we perceive it as a potential threat. Whether or not this serves us well is a secondary question, but the biases exist because otherwise we as a species would have not survived. We would have killed by the saber-toothed tiger. And recognizing what our biases are is I think, a first start. And I have to start with myself. So whether it be me as a trainer in a room, I need to be aware of what's my value system, what are my biases that I come from, and then also allow our program participants to go on a self-discovery. What might be the biases within our organization, how we approach our work compared to that of our customers or partners that we purchase from, sell to. So it's often a journey of self-discovery before we discover the other. And unless I understand what my preferred communication patterns are, before I understand my own culture, so to say, it becomes difficult to compare mine to that which is different. And it's sometimes unpleasant for companies or clients to go down that road. I've dealt a lot with German companies and a lot with US companies, both societies with a difficult history, both cultures who go about dealing with their history in different ways, and both cultures whose present day experience and present day behaviors are still heavily influenced by their respective histories. So drilling into these pain points and, let's say, in a German training room, addressing Germany's Nazi past and Holocaust past, and at the same time being in a US training room talking about slavery and the unresolved issues stemming from that. These are not easy conversations to have, and oftentimes corporate culture might be very reluctant to touch these topics because they see them as a ticking time bomb. My role as an external consultant, I just go in and say, well, I know what you, or I think I know what you do here internally when it comes to these topics, but you hired me to help you get better in working with others. So before we can do this, we need to look at ourselves and take the temperature in the room on these issues. So did that answer your question though? I'm not sure if I sidetracked a little bit here.
So it's not an easy one to answer. That's kind of why I asked it. So that was really quite an interesting answer, and it triggered another thought in my head as well. Now, let's say we're going into a meeting and I'll pretend I'm the buyer and I have perhaps a lady with me as a counterpart. We go and visit a supplier, and let's say during that meeting, I perceive something that I believe is an inappropriate behavior, as in what my culture would consider as inappropriate. Perhaps the lady that is with me is not being recognized in the appropriate way, is not being respected in the appropriate way. Now, intrigued to know, in that situation, how would you recommend you deal with that tactfully and effectively? So you recognize the cultural differences, but you need to address this situation and really kind of nip it in the bud, so to speak, but do it in a way that not everybody comes out of there either insulted or, upset.
Right. Now, that is a very interesting question to which I have probably multiple answers. The first answer would be, have you and your female colleague made an agreement before you entered into that situation? Because you might have, if you had done cultural training about this, you probably would have been both aware of the possibility of this happening in that interaction. So it would be smart in your scenario to have that conversation with your female colleague and saying, hey, so how do we want to approach this? Are you okay in taking a back seat of this conversation because of your gender role in our client's culture? And if she is okay with that, then that will set the tone for how you approach this. If she's not, or maybe the female in the scenario would be the highest ranking official, then it might be smart to use a indirect diplomatic language in which you both present yourselves as agents of your company with decision-making authority. And despite the fact that your foreign counterpart might not be treating your female colleague with the behavior or the respect that she is used to, she can still politely mark her claim as an agent in that negotiation process, right? It does not have to be controversial. In my experience, cultures that have different gender power roles than we do in Western Europe or North America, or the quote unquote Western world, which doesn't really exist, they often also have a very strong system of honor in which violating someone's honor is equally as inappropriate as violating those gender imbalances. So if you and your female colleague let your foreign counterpart know between the lines that they may have crossed the line with certain remarks or behaviors, that would alert them to being someone violating your honor, and that would be very uncouth, and they probably would not like that. I've yet to meet an environment where women are treated with inferiority because of a cultural predisposition in this interaction. It may be done so because they think they have a leverage over you in a negotiation situation. So it's weaponized, so to say. And if both sides realize, okay, we're playing that game, well, you have a choice. Do you want to engage in that kind of game, or do you not? And I guess that also depends on what is your desired outcome in this scenario. Do you want the deal or do you not want the deal? How much is losing that deal worth to you? Or how much is winning that deal worth to you? Which sacrifices are you willing to make? And that brings us back to answer number one. Do you have that agreement with your female colleague? What are we willing to take, right? What's the greatest amount of insult we are willing to tolerate? And once you have that agreement within your team, then whatever the other side brings is maybe fun.
I love it. Yep, that's really good. For me, the key in this case is preparation and role playing, scenario playing. What if so and so happens before you go into the meeting? Equally, would you think it would be sensible potentially? Let's say, for example, before I go to that meeting, I've met the supplier previously. Perhaps I built a relationship with one of the individuals that will be in that meeting. Would you recommend that I prepare that individual for the fact my colleague, she's a lady, has come into here. I recognize that culturally, in this person's culture, that women aren't treated the same. And I therefore take the responsibility to prepare that person, saying, this is what's, this is the person that's coming across. Can you be aware of this situation? Can you be aware of the authority she holds in my culture, etc.? Is that something you would also recommend?
I think my quick answer is yes. And my longer answer is depends on the relationship you're able to build with your foreign counterpart. And I mean, the scenarios that you're painting here, my brain goes to the Middle Eastern world, first and foremost, or even sub-Saharan Africa. And in both these cultural big areas, relationships are paramount to doing business, right? These are non-transactional cultures where nothing happens without a relationship. And if you are able to successfully develop these relationships, if they're so robust and carried by mutual trust, then introducing a a disturbance to that relationship, in this case, by introducing a female decision maker, that relationship can be robust enough to handle that. And they will say, yeah, of course, we're doing business. I know you, Dave, and you want to buy from us, and we got what you need. And we're happy to provide you with the product, service, material that you're buying from us. So we respect you as a client because our relationship is one of mutual gain. So how would this slight disturbance of bringing a female into this role player, into the scenario, be such a deterrent that the deal might fall apart? I would think that would be difficult to derail a negotiation at that point if you were able to secure a relationship over time.
Yeah, brilliant. Now, what also occurs to me is that each day almost we are recognizing there is more knowledge and understanding about differences between individuals, people, their genders. I lose track of all the changes that are occurring. How on earth do you keep up to date with the latest knowledge and understanding and development in this field?
Valid question. I'm not sure if I'm doing that enough, but that's a question I've been asking myself since I was a teenager, I guess. My wife will tell you that I am a sponge for information. So I like to read, I like to listen, I like to watch. I constantly feed my brain to an extent where I have trouble sorting it all sometimes, and maybe that comes with age. But I'm very keen on knowing more. There has yet to be the day where I say, I think I know enough now. I have not had a day like that. So my curiosity is not easily satisfied. And maybe that is also a reason why I do this work, because I am very, very interested in people. And if you ask my children, they will tell you how uncomfortable they get when they're out and about with me and we hear somebody in the store or in a parking lot or somewhere in the public sphere, and I overhear people speaking a different language or in a different accent. And my children want to avoid that I get too close to them so I don't start a conversation, because my children know once that happens, we're not going anywhere for the next hour. So I'm really curious in humanity. I want to learn why people do the things they do and how they do them, and maybe learn how can I do what I do better by listening to them. And yeah, I'm curious. So I never stop learning. In our field, we do have organizations where we provide each other with continuous learning, like most industries have some kind of body, some kind of association of industry-specific membership. And in our field, we have that as well, where we go to conferences and learn from one another, general practices, new research. So that's a fountain that keeps bringing up new waters.
Brilliant, brilliant. Now, before I ask my final question, keep an eye on the time. I'm sure people are very curious to learn more about you, what you do, the teaching that you have, perhaps the courses that you offer. Where's the best place they can go and connect with you and learn more about you?
Well, thank you for offering that opportunity to talk to your audience. Our website is the starting point. It's theculturemastery.com, and the article "the" is part of the name, so it's theculturemastery.com. I'm very active on LinkedIn. Of all the social media outlets, LinkedIn to me has the highest return on my time. And it is also an environment where people still predominantly talk about business and not so much about their cats playing piano or what they cooked over the weekend, which is all fine in its place and time. I use social media to further my connections, to educate myself, and hopefully inform the marketplace about the things that we do. So my LinkedIn is a good way to engage, as is our website. And from there, you'll find me in other spots around the internet. But I think let's start there.
Cool, brilliant. Okay, so the last question. Quite often we're talking big businesses here who have resources. But let's think of it from the smaller guy, the small to medium-sized enterprises that haven't got the strength and depth and financial clout to really help their employees when they're starting to branch out into international business, to help them to understand what they need to do before they go into new situations. So let's put ourselves in the case of a company that's going out to buy from a different country, never been to India before, never been to China, any of those sort of places, what advice would you give to them so that they could prepare themselves and their employees for the cultural differences they need to consider, perhaps be aware of, doing their homework on before they make that step out there? Where should they go? What resources are there? How do they go about preparing themselves?
If you go into China or India for the first time, since you picked those two countries, biggest markets in the world, local liaison is my 2-word answer. Is find somebody on the ground who can help you build relationships. Because in India and in China, nobody knows who you are. And if people don't know who you are, they have no reason to trust you. And the basis of any type of sales contract is people know you, they like you, and they trust you. And as a result of that, they might give you their money. And establishing that trust, you need somebody with a developed network in those markets. And both India and China tend to be relationship-focused societies, so even more important. If you, by contrast, said you needed to do this in Canada, the US, or let's say Germany, or even to a certain lesser degree, maybe even Brazil, I said, well, you don't need as much of a liaison there. You can go in on the merit of your accomplishments in your home markets, but still you want to prepare yourself for the behavioral general trends in these markets. And you can do so with resources that are available online. There are self-study courses that are available at comparatively small investment. We started offering open enrollment classes because of that, because a lot of times a corporation with enough resources will come and say, we booked the room, we have 25 people in our organization, please teach them. An SME doesn't have that. Many people who would like to participate. So we say, okay, here's our open enrollment course on doing business with South Korea. And then 10 different companies send 1 or 2 team members, and they usually sign non-disclosure agreements so that they don't have to violate any privacy concerns from their respective employers. And that makes it affordable for them as well. So there is an in-person component that can be done at a fairly reasonable expense. And then there are online tools that I'm happy to point you to. Once you get to know us, just hit me up and I can point you towards those courses that might just fit your budget.
That's brilliant. It's great to, I think, encompass all businesses. You know, the big boys out there, as we say, they've got the big resources, but the volume of customers actually are the small to mediums that are trying to get into a bigger state. So huge opportunities there. Yeah. And it's very difficult, isn't it? You know, if you're the solopreneur with your £5 million business, you know, how do you find the right partner, the right guides, the right resource, the right company to work with? It's, you know, as you say, it's all down to relationships, and the fact that you guys can support them in that, I think, is really important.
We do our best.
I'm sure you will. I found that absolutely fascinating. Thanks very much for sharing what we have, Christian. I guess you can tell that I could talk to you about this for quite some time, but we've run out of time now. But anyway, is there any last words any words of wisdom you want to share before you sign off today?
Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to share these things. And I'll leave you with one sentence that I tell every program participant. If you take away only one thing from our time together, let it be this: encourage your inner detective and sit down your inner judge. Because it's easy to judge that which we don't understand. Our judging mind is quick to jump to conclusions. Motivating your inner detective, your inner Sherlock Holmes, to investigate and to connect the dots, that's a much more painstaking activity in our brain. And yet I encourage you to make it, because being a good detective will give you the insights that your judge hasn't seen yet.
Brilliant. Wise words. Thanks very much for that, Christian. Been superb talking to you. And hopefully we'll meet up and chat some more one day.
Would love to. Thanks for having me, Dave.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
So there's another Real Life Buyer podcast. I do hope you enjoyed it and it's given you some ideas and inspiration for greater action and achievement. If you are a purchasing or a supply chain professional, business owner or director, come and join my Facebook group, the Purchasing and Supply Chain Community Hub, a safe place to engage with like-minded, friendly people. See you soon. Bye.